Good evening, El Paso. Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where we share the fun of the big questions with you. My name is Dr. Kim Diaz. I teach philosophy here at EPCC.
And my name is Jules Simon. I'm a philosopher and teach philosophy at the University of Texas, El Paso.
And today our guest is Dean Brian Kirby. Dean Brian Kirby graduated from New Mexico State University with a BA in philosophy and an MA in English. Brian began his EPCC journey in 2012 as assistant professor of English at the Rio Grande Campus. Since 2015, he has served concurrently as associate professor, district-wide coordinator, and campus coordinator. Beginning in 2017, he also took on the role of Co-Principal Investigator for the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC-UTEP, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you for having me. It's a joy. It's daunting, but I look forward to the conversation.
Daunting? Oh, we just have fun.
Oh,
yeah.
Fun
that's
with
good
the
to
big
hear.
questions.
Yeah.
And the little questions, and the first one is, what? Given your background, you have an MA in English and you've taught for several years. What would you
But
say?
also in philosophy.
That's right. You have the philosophical
Right.
background to filter your answers about English through, right? What do you think literature and poetry is all about?
I think literature is essentially, broadly speaking, a written expression. And then more focused in my world, it's including genres like short stories or novellas or novels. Even cartoons can have the stuff of literature. Film. I'm pleased to say with my television addiction that TV has, taken on the grit and grime of literature over the last generation and a half. I go back to shows like The Wire and The Sopranos and more recent ones like Fargo that I use in my classes to help students better appreciate the elements of literature and fiction. So for me, my understanding is more rooted in the written word, in prose. I'm not a great poet, and I'm not a great teacher of poetry, so I respect it, and I respect it enough to leave it alone, as they say. But it's something that I value, and it has great value for our students in it. But my focus is more in short stories, the novel, film, television.
Mm-hmm.
Did you prefer a certain type of tradition of literature?
Well,
when you were studying,
as I was finishing my undergrad in philosophy, I had a chance to take a writing workshop with a guy named Kevin McElvoy. He's literally one of those men or those teachers that we talk about who change lives, and he changed mine. And he introduced me to the form of short story writing, later the novella. And he was one of those guys who just valued writing, and he saw the magic in everybody's written work. And when you took a workshop with Mac, and you endured the overhaul of your story, Mac always found a way to find the magic and the worth in it. And he was literally one of those guys who grabbed me by the wrist and got me into graduate school. I was not a great undergraduate student, but he was formidable, and I'll remember him forever for that.
Another local, very influential poet just passed away this past week, Donna Snyder, here in El Paso.
Right.
And so if we can also give a shout out to Donna for all
Absolutely.
The awesomeness that she brought to this community,
Absolutely, 100%.
I know the strength of having a good mentor. My mentor passed away earlier this year, and similarly, the same sort of story. I began studying with him, and it just changed my life.
When I teach, I try to do as I experienced, and Mac was one of those guys, one of those teachers who saw a spark, I never try to use the word potential because I sort of see that as like fortune telling or seeing into the future, but he saw something he took that glimmer of hope, and he, like I said, he literally changed my trajectory, my direction. And if it weren't for him, I would not be sitting here today. I'd still be working at UPS, lugging boxes around, driving a big rectangular truck.
So in what way, maybe you could talk about some of the kinds of literature that he got you excited about. So in what way did you make your entry into, what kind of literature do you really enjoy, what's good about?
And this sort of touches on one of our questions, is The Magic of Blood by Dagoberto Gilb. And that was one of those collection of short stories published by UNM Press, by the way, where like the title is a little bit misleading. It may seem a little dark if you are dark like me or dark-minded like me. But it's really about the magic of family, the magic of kin, the magic of our blood relatives. And there's some great short stories in there. And Mac also had a way of teaching us the form of the short story through workshop, just through the experience of workshop. And I remember he always gave more than what I gave. Like, I remember turning in an 8 or 10 page short story, and he probably gave me 18 pages of end commentary. And again, he found the magic in it, and by reading the marginalia and his commentary, I learned so much more about just the form of short stories, not just my own, but he delved into characterization and narrative and playing with narrative, and it was amazing.
Maybe we can transition a little bit to your teaching choices in literature. Sounds like short stories included in that.
Sure.
But, yeah. But I think that's a sign of a really good teacher, is someone who takes your writing as a student seriously, a student's writing seriously, and takes the time and effort to make lengthy, in-depth comments. Because, as you note, and in my case as well, those can have profound effects and be life-changing, and steer you in making corrections in how you're developing as a writer or a philosopher, right?
So it never came off as a chore. It never came off as a job. It came off as, just something that he dove into because it was his life's work. And we talk about writers and we talk about their need to write. For Mac and for a lot of teachers, there's a need to teach. There's a need to. It's really a generous profession, and if you don't have that generosity about you, and if you sort of deal with students with a stiff arm or a small window of availability, I don't know if you're in the right profession. And so I think generosity is the key. He was a generous writer, he was a generous reader, and I took that from him, and I try to give that to my students when I'm in the classroom.
I said, earlier as a disclaimer, he's the one that will ask you all the cool questions, and I'll try to bring us back in focus.
Sure.
So, besides being life-changing, right? What would you say is the best part about reading literature or poetry or writing? Because it's a form of expression, and I think as humans we need to. If we don't, it's not healthy, and
Sure.
then we end up developing all sorts of neuroses. So it's a way to express ourselves, but as someone who has training in English and writing, from your perspective, what would you say is what's worthwhile for people to engage in writing or reading?
So
Wait, before you answer, you can get geeky about these answers because both Kim and I majored in English literature when we were undergraduates.
that's awesome.
Kim double majored in philosophy
You
and
did
English.
too, didn't
No,
you?
I minored in philosophy.
Oh.
And we need more English majors, right? The the guy who founded Google, or who was running Google, he says, give me an English lit major anytime, as a job applicant, because I think we tend to be analytical. I think we think things through thoroughly, maybe too much so. But there's no greater discovery than opening a book and reciting and just sort of getting lost in those pages. And this summer, I got fooled. I was in the airport, I was traveling, and I was in that part of the airport bookstore, and they mostly sell bestsellers, right? And so I was just like, oh boy. So I was like, I'll just pick up a paper or whatever. Among the bestsellers was like a book that very clearly had like a marketing team behind it, and it was intended to sell copies. And then I looked closely, and I found myself like I was judging a book by its cover, literally. And it was by a favorite writer, Tom Perrotta, and it was a follow-up to a book called Election. It's called Tracy Flick Can't Win. And even though it was, supposedly among the bestseller, or like, I guess we call it like popcorn entertainment, or, it's supposedly not the work of literature bestsellers, but it's amazing. It changes narrative. It's challenging. It causes one to reflect on how we treat one another, and it was one of those great discoveries when you are least expecting it. And I think that's what reading allows people to do. And I worry sometimes that the reading or writing via the social media is getting consumed in small chunks. When Twitter had like the 140 character limit, or people are updating Facebook statuses that they're using all their words to just share what's going on in their life at that moment. But I'm realizing that people are reading more and more. I think there was a study out by the NEA that showed that adults between the ages of 18 and 24 reported reading like 90% more poetry in 2018 than in years prior. So it's not, I think my worries are slightly founded, but maybe overblown. I don't know if I answered your question, but I touched on it.
The sense of you never know. I mean, I've had experiences like that where I'm reading, 1984 or Animal Farm or The Cat's Cradle, and I'm just blown away. Kurt Vonnegut blew me away because of the change in narrative and the perspective, and what he could do with science fiction, And so it's like you're just sitting there reading, and all of a sudden, you're not the same person. It's life-changing. Novels, short stories.
Sure.
And there was a comment you made very similar to a comment that Brian Yothers made when we interviewed him. And he said, I just love reading because I get so caught up in whatever I'm reading that I can be oblivious to everything that's happening around me. I can, be standing in a line, reading a book and not know that it's my turn finally to pay at the cashier or something like that, right? So it's that getting lost in the story and suspending one's ego's obsession.
Absolutely.
Existential angst.
Absolutely.
Suspending the existential angst, where you enter a land of fiction and fantasy, or biography or whatever.
So if you read something that is exciting and profound, do you tend to put it on a shelf and save it for a second read or a third read? Or I found that I do something, and I don't know if it has the weight that I want it to have, but I pass it along to others, hoping that they'll find the same value. And I realize it might get lost, or it might just get shelved on a different shelf. A lot of times people are just like, well, I appreciate that you're excited about it, but let me make that discovery for myself. And they may not be articulating that out loud, but I think, sometimes our excitement and getting other people to read what we want them to read can be off-putting, because it's like we know what our discoveries are, And when we don't allow other people to experience their own discoveries and we try to shoehorn that in for them, it might be doing them a disservice.
Well, I teach. Whatever I'm like totally fascinated by, I'm like, okay, everybody, it's in the syllabus.
Right.
But that's the
You know.
normativity question I was bringing up to you earlier this morning.
Okay, what is normativity?
It's when we practice those kinds of exercises, behaviors, especially in instances where we're teaching or, you know, in a way that people can look to us as models. And then we choose something to focus our attention on. And if we believe in it, then we're going to teach it to our students or recommend it to others, you know.
Well, I
so
think about it as sharing it. You share it with others.
We share it with others, right? But then that creates that kind of normative axis, right? So you have to, I think the issue is a really important one that you bring up, like how do we recommend this or that to the other without dictating to someone that this is something you have to follow rigorously or else you're going to fail out of life. Right?
Sure. I go back to Kim's example of being in the classroom, and it's sort of the student's role to polarize things, right? And if they see me excited about a piece of literature, their role is to be like, nuh-uh, no thanks, teacher. So sometimes I try to like come in with this diminished sort of like, look, you guys, it's out of my hands, but you gotta experience this. I'm sorry beforehand, and you know, if you get through it, hats off.
Show no emotion.
Right. And usually they see right through the facade, but they slug their way through it. And then every now and again, thankfully, there are students who find the value, and I can appreciate that because I was one of those students who had a hard time diving into works, and I was probably ADHD before those letters existed in everyday discourse, and couldn't sit still and comprehend. And it wasn't until I had teachers who taught me how to read, and Mac was one of them. But yeah, it's reading is transformative, and like Dr. Yothers says, you know, you can literally tune the world out and then bring it back in when you're done.
I think, though, to go back to your question, is that okay, so it's been life-changing for me, right? And so then I share it with others, and I'm gonna try that approach of not be enthusiastic about it, so I don't put them off, but just to be like about it. But what I've noticed is that there are some of the students who are ready because of their life experiences, the stuff that they've gone through or they're going through, and it clicks. But if it doesn't, then at least we planted the seed. And so later, my hope is, you know, because of life experiences they'll have had later, they'll remember what we talked about.
Absolutely.
And then it will click and it will be helpful.
Sure.
Because I'm sure you've had students who email you or write you years later, and then they're like, yeah, remember I was a student this year, you know, and then thank you so much for sharing that book with us or whatever.
Sure.
So just because they don't click right there during that semester, it doesn't mean that they were looking at their phone and ignoring you.
Sure.
You know?
I had that experience one time. Kim and I went to get a massage together at Massage Envy, and parked my truck in front of the place. You know, we come out and there's a sign on my windshield, a note saying, "Thank you, Dr. Simon, for teaching us about the beautiful and sublime in Kant's Critique of Judgment. We'll always remember that."
Wow.
Yeah, and then they signed their names, you know, 2 students who had taken the course with me.
Wow.
That was pretty cool, you know, that they left it on my truck.
That they know your truck's
they
license
know my
plate.
truck, and they left
Oh, they saw him walking out.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. So yeah, I get an email from a student, and we argue all the time about Cathedral, the Ray Carver short story. And I was probably down one day and probably down on relationships. And when we talked about it in class, I was like, well, I don't see this narrator changing. I don't see, he may have had this great experience with the blind man, but that doesn't mean his relationship with his wife is going to change. So no, the narrator doesn't change. And the student was just flabbergasted and so put off by that reading of it. And so years later he writes, he's like, here's why the narrator changed. And you're dead wrong about that, Brian. And until you admit so, I'm going to dog you via email. I gave up and allowed him that.
And what about writing? What would you say is the best thing about writing?
Again, there's that sense of discovery. You get lost in the same way. Turning pages as you're reading hopefully gives way to watching pages on the screen or however your process is, and it's hard in today's world when you're trying to pay bills to carve out time for writing. There are writers who do a much better job of it than I do. I tend to write when the muse strikes, and most writing teachers would say that's the absolute wrong way to go about it. I say as long as words are getting onto paper, then it's a good thing. But that discovery is outstanding. And I've worked with students in the past, and I don't mean to toot my own horn, but it's a great experience when students have pages that have accumulated over a semester and they're like, this is my work. And it's tangible and you can see it and it's mine. And I think that goes a long way too.
There's one line I really like that Baudelaire came up with in this regard. And he says, every day, despite how I'm feeling, because I can get pretty moody, melancholic, right? I write one line a day to pay my rent.
That's awesome.
Yeah, one line a day to pay my rent. There's that one line a day I have to write. So that comes back to, getting busy paying the bills, or then finding time to have to carve out time to do your writing.
Well,
where the writing can be like that carving out,
sure,
but it can also be directly plugged into the paying of the bills. I think that was Baudelaire's point anyway.
Right? Wouldn't that be the huge payoff? And sometimes in the profession, whether you're doing grad school or you're early in your teaching career, sometimes even reading for pleasure seems
what is that?
Right, like you're
Who has time,
breaking
right?
the rules and you're doing something very wrong. And if you have time to do this, then you have time to grade, or you have time to add to your tenure portfolio, or you have time to find some hours to do community service work or what have you, which are all great things. But there's the academy is chock full of, I guess, choices, and sometimes we make difficult ones. And but if I had to go, if I could advise the younger me, I'd find time to read and write daily.
Mm-hmm. Because then otherwise, why are we doing this, right?
Right. Exactly. What's the point? I mean, it's great to write a wonderful email, but I don't know if that's as fulfilling as putting together a well-crafted short story or screenplay, or whether it's one decent line.
I think it's just the human. I mean, I could be generalizing, and I probably am, but I think humans have the need to express themselves. And some of them do it through writing, and some of them do it through dance or sports. So, whatever.
Music.
Yeah, right. But that is the cherry on top, that that makes everything different and better.
Mm-hmm.
So we have really 3 philosophers and 3 literature people here, writers. What would you say is the difference between literature and philosophy? Because they're so similar.
Right?
Like, you need words for philosophy.
Sure. That's a great question, and it's, I think it's Kelly Mays in one of our introductory literature books. She points out what Plato said about fiction or literature, that it's sort of frivolous, or it.
Right. He didn't like poets.
Right.
They get carried away and they lose their sense of self. It's dangerous. The gods drive you. The poetry gods drive you to distraction
and away from reason.
Exactly.
Right. You get lost in these floral language, rush of language, and that's not reason. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think, in terms of like a Dagoberto Gilp, who's very much like a constructionist in terms of writing process, I think philosophy has a place in it doesn't allow for jumps in logic. Like literature, you very rarely see phrases like, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, with a puff of smoke, the story changes. Right? It can't defy explanation and get away with it. Otherwise, it becomes the puff piece.
Yeah.
There's an exception to that generally well-accepted rule.
Yeah. Wait a minute. There is what I'm thinking of Bishop Berkeley.
Okay.
The rationalist. Was he? No, he was an idealist, empiricist idealist.
Subjective idealism.
Yes. Who said everything exists because I perceive them, and they remain in existence because when I'm not perceiving them, the mind of God is perceiving everything. So there have been philosophers who make that leap.
Okay.
Yes.
But then someone I just taught, Kierkegaard, does the same thing. Mm-hmm. He goes from in the stages of life, there's the ascetic stage, the ethical stage, and then the religious stage. And at each stage, the aesthetic stage, which is where we're at, right? Talking about literature and writing and storytelling, and you eventually get to the point where you've tapped out its all meaning potential, and you have to, for ultimate significance, make a leap. But to the life of the ethical, and to paying your bills responsibly, and taking care of other chores of the world.
Sure.
And, in the church or the state or our educational institutions. But then, following the rules of others also leads one to a certain kind of despair, right? One has to make a jump to what's most important in life, whatever that might be, right?
I don't think philosophers have as much fun jumping from one reality into another.
Right.
The way that writers do. Literature.
I thought you could have punctuated that sentence after the word fun.
Period. Period.
That's right.
You're probably right.
I kid, of course.
No, it's true. Yeah, philosophers tend to be very matter of fact, serious, no fun with we need to analyze the reality until it's not fun anymore.
No, that's why we intentionally have our lead in having fun with the big questions in life.
Absolutely.
We're going against the grain.
I kid, of course, as a philosophy student. But I was one of those philosophy students who was lucky because my instructors were very patient and again, like Mac, they were very generous and they hand and held me through some very difficult courses. And I was sort of living between the UPS life of up at 4 o'clock in the morning, going to work until 10, and then going to class, and then having instructors like Tim Cleveland or Dan Scotia take the time during office hours to explain very difficult concepts to me repeatedly. And to this day, I'm not sure if I left them satisfied with my understanding of some of the things they were trying to explain. But people ask then, and they still ask today, like, why did you study philosophy? And it was such a grind for me, but it was the challenge and the payoff was so monumental that nothing else compared. Mm.
I think it's mind-blowing. Philosophy is mind-blowing once you start thinking about it, like really. But literature is mind-blowing too, except like you mentioned, literature is fun and philosophy is just perplexing. What about the truth? Because I think philosophers and writers and poets, we all care about the truth.
Sure. Do you remember the 1996 film Fargo? Opens with the claim, and the following is based on a true story. They said that they included that so that they could get their audience just a little bit more enwrapped. It's not based on a true story. And then the TV series of the same name before each episode has the following is based on a true story. And Noah Hawley explained it away during an interview with the New York Times and this was 2017, right before the previous administration was about to take over the White House, and they were using phrases like alternative facts. And he said, we live in a post-truth world now. The idea that there's one clear, true understanding of a given is out the window, and he had a great line between two characters. A sheriff says, "Well, I got the facts," and the other investigator says, "Well, I got different facts." Mm-hmm. And so it really stuck with me about how we view truth now in a world where people can say, "Well, my impression of that instance or that situation is my truth."
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
On that, well, I do think that pluralism is a good thing.
Okay.
Because, pre-postmodernism, right, it was the truth, and which was not really the truth.
Okay.
But it was the established truth, and then everything else was incorrect, and it was oppressive.
And the important point there is the difference between the definite and indefinite article.
Right.
So
the truth versus a truth.
Sure.
Right?
So allowing for pluralism, I really do think it's a good thing. And I think part of our show is that, we're here situated in the border between the U.S. and Mexico, and things here are different than in the middle of either country. Mm-hmm. And so this, I think, is a very good place from where to philosophize, because things that a philosopher or writer might take for granted in other parts of either country, here at the border they're questioned. So I think diversity and plurality is good, but I see the problem with what you're saying in terms of I think maybe it's the intention
Sure.
to still there's different perspectives, but in terms of the function and the validity of them, they may not be useful.
Okay.
And useful for who, right? I don't know. What do you think?
Part of it is that, to come back to the definite and indefinite articles, is that once we embrace the fact that my truth is always just a truth that's been imparted to me, that is, it's the way I look at it, the way I see it,
Sure.
right? Then that undercuts the kind of, forceful, perhaps even violent ways that people can treat others and with their claims of knowing the truth,
Right.
the absolute truth, right?
Like,
Even to the point of death.
Yeah, like, Spanish Inquisition type of stuff, right?
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, so that wasn't very...
But this is really important.
Those times were not that good.
They
weren't
not even
good
today. Think of,
Yeah.
Satanic verses.
Yeah. Roshad, I think is his name.
What's his? Yeah, I can't think of his name. He wrote Satanic Verses.
Salman Rushdie.
Salman Rushdie, and he just got attacked. You know, for this book that undercuts those kinds of claims, right? Those kinds of claims, and so writers' lives can be endangered. If they're going to be dealing in the truth in such a way that they challenge truth claims by others, right?
Right, and that leads me to think about, you know, what's the responsibility of the reader or the audience? Because I think, you know, when we talk about challenge and material, does a reader just have a knee-jerk reaction and that's it? And then they're allowed to move based on that reaction and to inflict harm on another person? And then what choices or what choices was Rushdie making, and was he aware that it's a tough question for me to wrap my head around about the responsibility of the reader.
Yeah, I think just in general, since we all work in the academy, right? I think that is also a responsibility of our educational institutions. That's unlike any other institution, right? So in educational institutions, I think it's our responsibility as educators to not necessarily train Pulitzer Prize winning, Nobel Prize winning authors and things like that. I mean, fine, if that happens, that's great, right? Sure. But to train good readers, to train them to read for multiple interpretations and multiple perspectives and things like that. And it's when when we fall into out of laziness or whatever misaligned intentions that my way or the highway is the only way you can learn or read only this narrow range of material.
Right.
I think that's when we start getting into trouble.
And I want to say,
start censoring things, and
that is a value of pluralism in the classroom too. You know, just allowing the students to hear different perspectives, and not take them personally, but just to hear them. And teaching ethics is great because, or social political or philosophy, general philosophy, right? Because I'm over here like articulating Hobbes' argument, and it doesn't mean that I believe it, but I'm going to make the best argument for it, right? And so it's such a good exercise for us humans to be able to express ideas without, and just to think abstractly, right? And just to look, okay, this is the argument, and doesn't mean that the students don't know where I stand.
I remember as a student taking a philosophy art class, and again, opening students' minds and eyes to different perspectives. And the professor showed works by Mapplethorpe, who back in the late 80s was very controversial because of his black and white photography. And students exited the classroom because they had that knee-jerk offense to the imagery. And it was hard for the professor to reel them back in, because now the line, the wall was, it was just, there was no turning back. And so
the normative line was crossed,
right?
That they had set up by other teachers or other, family members or whatever.
Exactly.
And that becomes a hard line to deal with, especially in a classroom, right? And that's, that takes real skill, a skill by a teacher to be able to deal with those kinds of lines, and perhaps a little stand-up comedy.
Right?
Yes. So what ended up happening?
I don't think we saw that student again.
Oh, wow.
And and I think some people take a philosophy class with this predetermined notion that I'm going to come in swinging, because philosophers are heretics. They're here to denounce, all things biblical, all things. They're going to make fun of people's devotions, and so people, come in with this their mind made up. And so I think once that image was, seen, that person was like, never again. I've had my piece, and these people will never come around to my way of thinking. And I think they were trying to, that person was trying to convert a class full of, honestly, students who were taking an elective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, humor is helpful.
I'm teaching philosophy of art in the spring, so I'm going to remember your your story. But I think literature, so talking about this difference between philosophy and literature on this issue, on this way of getting at it can be insightful, because philosophers they're challenging in the way that they raise questions. They raise questions, and they get students entertaining how to raise a question, and then that gets, threatens their self-identity,
sure,
which is closely guarded,
sure,
with many, many likes or dislikes, right? But in literature, literature gets at it a little bit differently and more indirectly. The teachers of literature take us on travels and journeys,
sure,
to inhabit other perspectives, right?
Right.
And to see the world in a different way,
you get
right?
seduced into the story.
You get seduced.
And bam.
Exactly.
Sometimes it can backfire, right? Sometimes the writer's like, look, I put it all there for you, and it's your choice what you do with it. I go to another favorite television show, The Sopranos, and David Chase told his audience, who've been arguing since 2007 or 2008, is Tony Soprano dead? And he told them, I gave it all there. You decide. And that's another great work where there's a responsibility of the viewer or the audience member. Some people see The Sopranos as a great way to look at, what's wrong with the American family or what's right with the American family. Others just see the gangsters and the strippers and the gambling and the drugs, and they don't get what David Chase was going after. But I think literature is great in that sense, is that it gives the reader, the viewer, responsibility and some choices, and it allows them to grow if they want to.
I'm thinking literature is more like a full human, and philosophy is like the skeletal system. It's not just the structure.
I'm writing a paper right now on embodied phenomenology.
Okay.
Phenomenology of embodiment. So the skeletal thing doesn't work for me.
Well, okay. So from the questions we had given you, we still have a few.
Sure. Can we touch on the Zeitgeist?
Yeah, let's do it. The question was, how do writers and poets contribute to a Zeitgeist? So what is a Zeitgeist?
So I wanted to see if our understanding aligns. The way I understand that is like sort of a collective consciousness, unconsciousness, subconsciousness. And this goes back to, again, the responsibility. And I was thinking about satire and how satire may not have room in today's world of literature. And I go back to 1974. It's a comedy, but I think it's more dark satire, Blazing Saddles. And I don't know if you've seen it recently or lately.
A long time ago.
It's
when it came out.
Yeah, I mean, it skewers its subject, and it's very pointed. Sorry about that. And I remember I caught it on, as I was channel surfing, and I caught it on like the family version of one of the big three networks. And their editors, or the FCC at the time, deemed that there's a scene around a campfire when all the cowhands are eating beans, therefore they're quite gassy.
Yeah.
So they edit all of those noises out. But the N word stayed on in one of the big three family version. And it was like this, and they were showing it at a time where it was meant for kids.
Yeah.
And so, but then I was like, in 2022, could a film like that have been made, or would it have the same sort of resonance, or would would people have, again, a knee-jerk reaction where they're like, I find the gratuitous use of that word, or that's not humorous to me. I don't see the satire, I just see something that's willing to be offensive.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, the extent to which, it's Zeitgeist, so the extent to which we
I think
deal with stereotypes, because that's a lot of what's going on, right?
Right.
In that movie and other ones like it.
Right.
How does one deal with stereotypes then?
Sure.
As a comic sort of commentary.
Or there's American Psycho.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I was thinking of Rush Hour more recently. Jackie Chan and Chris
Tucker.
Yes, right. And so, that's more recent, but still it's humor and it's stereotypes. But it seems to me that we keep getting more and more serious and less, it's not okay to make fun of ourselves.
Right.
So, yeah. Whereas before it seemed to be okay.
I also think it goes back to your point about having reliable teachers. And I remember as a kid, my friends quoting from Blazing Saddles, which is probably unnerving for any parent to hear an 11-year-old using some of that language. And my mom pulled me aside and she's like, I need you to understand why this movie is funny and what this movie is doing.
Yeah.
It's not funny because those cowboys are speaking that way. It's funny because they're being made fun of.
Mm-hmm.
And I was lucky to have a mom who would allow me to experience that, or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or Deer Hunter was probably a little too heavy, but still, she walked me through difficult concepts as a young man, or a young boy, really. And so sometimes, I guess the ultimate educator, or the first educator, is the one that's at home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry.
I know, I'm just like, no, it's true.
I had just thinking about it. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Nurse Ratched just passed away.
Oh, the actress?
Yeah, she just passed away, and
wow,
she had that movie on my mind lately.
I forget her name.
I can't remember. I just remember Nurse Ratched.
Okay.
I can't remember the actress's name, but she won a prize for her role.
Absolutely.
The Nobel Prize.
And of course, Ken Kesey was very upset with the adaptation of that book, and right. And Dad is purported to never have seen the film and wants no part of it, except maybe the residuals.
I'm still thinking about Zeitgeist. Because everybody, I don't know if there's a way not to be part of the Zeitgeist. I think, we're all over here like old enough to have lived through a couple of Zeitgeists, a couple of generations where things were different 30 years ago, things were different 20 years ago, things were different 10 years ago than what they are now. And
but I think so. That's thinking of it in terms of how does the Zeitgeist then determine the subject matter for a writer. But writers themselves contribute to the formation of the Zeitgeist, right?
Some generations are more political than others. What is, in your opinion, your thoughts? What are your thoughts on literature and poetry / literature, poetry, and the political?
I think it was a week or 2 weeks ago when I opened the Times, the El Paso Times, and I saw the headline essentially read, Texas paves the way in the number of banned books. It's just shy of 1,000, or I think it's 841. And that was to me,
should we be proud of this?
No.
Right?
It's frightening. And and again, it goes back to, who's who's responsible to teach our children how to not just read and comprehend and string words together to understand a sentence, but to dig deeper. And if they don't have the chance to find those works on their own in the library, they're going to point and click their way to finding them. So that maneuver is purely political, right? It's just a way to say, hey, I'm keeping your children safe, vote for me next time, and don't forget to hit the donate button on the website. And so, but then I'm thinking about how do writers, contribute to the political? And I'm trying to conjure a novel that I read recently. There's the political thriller, but there was a book that I read probably 18 years ago, and the title escapes me again. But it was about a CIA operative who had a very dark private life. And he enjoyed scouring the underground nightlife of New York and DC. And it was about his road to discovery. And he discovered a lot of things about himself, but during the day, he had to be very well put together, and he wasn't overtly political because that would jeopardize his job, but he was immersed in it and around it all the time. But to me, most immediately, the political in literature in Texas, sadly, is rooted in what we can't access.
I think that the need for a human to be creative versus if you want to use your talent to advance a political view, what is the right way to go, if there is a right way. I'm thinking Bob Dylan there for a while, got political, and
well, just another way to get at this and is that what writers do, especially ones who are, say, a little bit more politically conscious, is they transgress borders. The creative process is one where you discover and explore and test boundaries and push ideas.
Right.
And I think that's healthy and helpful for our society.
Marvin Gaye in the world of music,
Mm-hmm.
but Orwell for me was very political and super creative, with his science fiction. But I think science fiction can be very political.
Absolutely, it's a wide open, frontier. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it allows, there's a lot of freedom there for writers to explore, because they can, literally create worlds,
right?
Beings.
Well, speaking of literally creating, we have to bring our time here to an end.
This has been a blast. It's
awesome.
Been a wonderful conversation.
And this has been Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera. My name is Dr. Kim Diaz.
I'm Jules Simon.
Our guest, Dean Brian Kirby. Thank you so much. Join us next time.
Thank you.